The fourth dimension. Let's take by way of example, a living cell. It may be exactly equal in length, breadth, and height to another, a dead cell. Yet still, there is something in the living cell that is lacking in the dead cell, something we are unable to measure. We say that is vital force, try to explain the vital force as a kind of motion. But in reality we do not explain anything by this, only give a name to a phenomenon which remains inexplicable. According to some scientific theories, vital force must be resolvable into physico-chemical elements, into simpler forces. But not one of these theories can explain how the one passes into the other, and in what relation the one stands to the other. We are unable to express in a physico-chemical formula the simplest manifestations of life energy. As long as we are unable to do so, we have no right, in a strictly logical sense, to regard vital processes as identified with physico-chemical processes. We may accept philosophical monism, but we have no reasons for accepting the physico-chemical monism imposed upon us from time to time, which identifies vital and psychic processes with physico-chemical processes. Our mind may come in an abstract way to the conclusion of the unity of physico-chemical, vital and psychic processes, but for science, for exact and concrete knowledge, these three classes of phenomena stand quite separate from one another. For science, three classes of phenomena, mechanical force, vital force, and psychic force, pass into one another only partially and apparently without any fixed or calculable proportions. Therefore, scientists will be justified in explaining vital and psychic processes as a kind of motion only when they have found a means of transforming motion into vital and psychic energy, then vice versa, and of calculating such a transformation. This means that such an affirmation would be possible only when it is known what number of calories contained in a definite quantity of coal are necessary for starting the life of one cell. How many atmospheres of pressure are necessary for the formation of one thought or one logical deduction? As long as these are not known, physical, biological, and psychic phenomena, as studied by science, take place on different planes. Their unity can be surmised, but nothing can be affirmed positively. If one and the same force acts in physico-chemical, vital and psychic processes, it may be supposed that it acts in different spheres only partly contiguous with one another. If science really possessed knowledge of the unity of at least vital and physico-chemical phenomena, then it would be able to create living organisms. In this expectation there is nothing extravagant. People construct machines and apparatus that are much more complicated externally than a simple one-cell organism. Yet they are unable to construct such an organism, they can only duplicate or clone it. This means that there is something in a living organism, which does not exist in a lifeless machine. A living cell contains something that is lacking in a dead one. We have every right to call this something equally inexplicable and unmeasurable. In examining man, we have good reason for putting to ourselves the question, which part is bigger in him, the measurable or the unmeasurable? How can I answer your question about the fourth dimension, writes Morozov in his letter to his fellow prisoners, when I myself have no dimension in the direction indicated by you? But what real grounds has Morozov for affirming so definitely that he has not this dimension? Can he measure anything in himself? Two principal functions of man, life and thought, are in the domain of the unmeasurable. We know so vaguely and so imperfectly what man really is, and we have in ourselves so much that is enigmatic and incomprehensible from the point of view of the geometry of three dimensions, that we have no reason to deny the fourth dimension or in denying spirits. On the contrary, we have ample grounds for looking for the fourth dimension precisely in ourselves. We have to confess to ourselves clearly and definitely that we do not know in the least what man really is. For us, he is an enigma, and we must accept this enigma as such. The fourth dimension promises to explain something in this enigma. Let's then try to see what the fourth dimension can give us, if we approach it with the old methods but without the old prejudices for or against spiritualism. Let's again imagine a world of plane beings possessing only two dimensions of length and breadth, inhabiting a flat surface. Then imagine on this surface, living beings having the shape of geometrical figures and capable of moving in two directions. At the very beginning of the examination of the conditions of life for these flat beings, we come face to face with an interesting fact. These beings will be able to move only in two directions on their plane. They will be unable to rise above this plane or to sink below it. In the same way, they will be unable to see or feel anything lying outside of their plane. If one of these beings rises above the plane, he will completely pass away from the world of the other beings similar to him. He will vanish, disappear, no one will know whither. If we suppose that the organs of vision of these beings are situated on their edges, on their outer lines, then they will not be able to see the world lying outside their plane at all. They will see only lines lying on their plane. They will see each other, not as they really are, i.e. the shape of geometrical figures, but only in the form of lines. In the same way, all the objects of their world will also appear to them as lines. What is also important is that all lines, whether straight or curved, with angles or lying at different angles to the line of their edge, will appear to them alike. They will not be able to see any difference in the lines themselves. But at the same time, the lines will differ for them by strange properties, which they will probably call the motion or the vibration of lines. The center of a circle will be entirely inaccessible to them. They will be unable to see it. In order to reach the center of a circle, a two-dimensional being will have to dig or cut his way through the mass of the flat figure having the thickness of one atom. The process of digging will appear to him as an altering of the line of the circumference. If a cube is placed on his plane, then this cube will appear to him in the form of the four lines bounding the square touching his plane. Of the whole cube, only this square will exist for him. He will be unable even to imagine the rest of the cube. For him, the cube will not exist. If several bodies came into contact with this plane, for the plane being there would exist in each of them only one surface that has come into contact with his plane. This surface, that is the lines bounding it, will appear to him as an object of his own world. If, through his space, that is, through his plane, there passes a multicolored cube, the passage of the cube will appear to him as a gradual change in the color of the lines bounding the square that lies on his plane. If we suppose that the plane being is made able to see with his flat side, the one facing our world, it is easy to imagine what a wrong concept of our world he will receive. The whole universe will appear to him in the form of a plane. It is very probable that he will call this plane ether. Consequently, he will either completely deny all phenomena which take place outside his plane, or regard them as happening in his own plane, in his ether. Unable to explain on his plane all the phenomena observed by him, he may call them miraculous, lying above his understanding, beyond his space in the third dimension. Having observed that the inexplicable events occur in a certain consecutiveness, in a certain dependence, one upon another, and also probably in a dependence on some laws, the plane being will cease to consider them miraculous and will attempt to explain them by means of more or less complicated hypotheses. The appearance of the dim idea of another parallel plane will be for a plane being the first step towards the right understanding of the universe. He will then imagine all the phenomena he is unable to explain on his own plane as occurring on that parallel plane. At this stage of development, the whole of our world will appear to him as a plane and parallel to his own plane. Neither relief nor perspective will exist for him as yet. A mountain landscape will appear to him as a flat photograph, people, animals, and plants as in Egyptian hieroglyphs. His concept of the world will certainly be very poor and full of errors. The big things will be taken for the small things for the big, and altogether, whether near or far, will appear to him equally remote and inaccessible. Having recognized that there is a world parallel to his plane world, the two-dimensional being will say that of the true nature of the relations between these two worlds he knows nothing. In the parallel world there will be much that will appear inexplicable for the two-dimensional being, for instance a lever or a pair of wheels on an axle. Their action will appear quite inconceivable to the plane being, whose concept of laws of motion is limited by motion on a plane. It is quite possible that this phenomenon will be considered supernatural and later will be called in a more scientific way, superphysical. In studying these superphysical phenomena, the plane being may stumble upon the idea that a lever or wheels contain something immeasurable, but nevertheless existing. From this there is only one step to the hypothesis of the third dimension. The plane being will base this hypothesis precisely on inexplicable facts, such as the rotation of wheels. He may ask himself whether the inexplicable may not really be the unmeasurable and then begin gradually to elucidate for himself the physical laws of three-dimensional space. But he will never be able to prove mathematically the existence of this third dimension, because all his geometrical speculations will proceed only on a plane, on 2 dimensions, and therefore he will project onto a plane the results of his mathematical conclusions, in this way destroying all their meaning. The plane being will be able to obtain the first notion of the nature of the third dimension simply by means of logical reasonings and comparisons. That means that in examining the inexplicable that lies in the flat photograph, representing for him our world, the plane being may arrive at the conclusion that many phenomena are inexplicable for him. Because in the objects causing these phenomena there may be a certain difference which he does not understand and cannot measure. Further, he may conclude that a real body must differ in some way from an imaginary one. Having once admitted the hypothesis of the third dimension, he will have to say that the real body, unlike the imaginary body, must possess at least a small third dimension. In the same way the plane being may come to the recognition that he must possess the third dimension himself. After arriving at the conclusion that a real body of 2 dimensions cannot exist, that this is but an imaginary figure, the plane being will have to say to himself that since the third dimension exists, he must himself possess the third dimension, because otherwise having only 2 dimensions he would be but an imaginary figure, existing only in somebody's mind. The plane being will reason in the following way. If the third dimension exists, I am either a being of 3 dimensions or I do not exist in reality but only exist in somebody's mind space. In reflecting why he does not see his third dimension, the plane being may stumble upon the thought that his extension along the third dimension, just like the extension of other bodies along the third dimension, is very small. These reflections may bring the plane being to the conclusion that for him, the question of the third dimension is connected with the problem of small magnitude. In investigating the world in a philosophical way, the plane being will from time to time doubt the reality of everything surrounding him, and the reality of himself. He may think that his concept of the world is wrong and that he does not even see it as it really is. Musings about things as they appear, and about things as they are may follow from this. The plane being could possibly surmise that in the third dimension things must appear as they are, i.e. that he will see in the same things more than he saw in 2 dimensions. Verifying all these reasonings from our point of view, that is from the point of view of beings of 3 dimensions, we must recognize that all the conclusions of the plane being are perfectly right. They lead him to the right understanding of the world and to the cognition, though theoretical in the beginning, of the third dimension. We may profit by the experience of the plane being and try to find whether there is anything in the world towards which we are in the same relation as the plane being is towards the third dimension. In examining the physical conditions of the life of man, we find in them an almost complete analogy with the conditions of life of the plane being who begins to be aware of the third dimension. We shall start by examining our relation towards the invisible. At first, man considers the invisible as miraculous and supernatural. Gradually, with the evolution of knowledge, the idea of the miraculous becomes less and less necessary. Everything within the sphere accessible to observation, and unfortunately far beyond it, is regarded as existing according to definite laws, as the result of certain definite causes. But the causes of many phenomena remain hidden, and science is forced to limit itself to a classification of these inexplicable phenomena. In studying the character and properties of the inexplicable in different branches of our knowledge, in physics and chemistry, in biology and in psychology, we can arrive at certain general conclusions concerning the character of the inexplicable. That means we can formulate the problem as follows. Is not the inexplicable a result of something unmeasurable for us, which exists, first in those things which as they appear to us that we can measure fully, and second, in things which as they appear to us we can have no measurement? We can think that this very inexplicability may be the result of the fact that we examine and attempt to explain within the limits of 3 dimensions, phenomena that pass into the domain of a higher dimension. To put it differently, are we not in the position of the plane being trying to explain as happening on a plane, phenomena that take place in 3-dimensional space? There is a great deal that confirms the probability of such a supposition. It is quite possible that many inexplicable phenomena are inexplicable only because we wish to explain them on our plane, i.e. within our three-dimensional space, while really they occur outside our plane, in the domain of higher dimensions. Having come to the conclusion that we are surrounded by the world of the unmeasurable, we must admit that until now, we have had an entirely wrong concept of the objects of our world. We knew before that we see things and represent them to ourselves not as they really are. Now we may say more definitively that we do not see in things that part of them which is unmeasurable for us, lying in the fourth dimension. The last conclusion brings us to the idea of the difference between the imaginary and the real. We saw that the plane being, having arrived at the idea of the third dimension, must conclude that if there are three dimensions, a real body of two dimensions cannot exist. A two-dimensional body would be only an imaginary figure, a section of a body of three dimensions or its projection in two-dimensional space. Admitting the existence of the fourth dimension, we must recognize in the same way that if there are four dimensions, a real body of three dimensions cannot exist. A real body must possess at least a very small extension along the fourth dimension, otherwise it will be only an imaginary figure. The projection of a body of four dimensions in three-dimensional space, like a cube, drawn on paper. In this way we must come to the conclusion that there may exist a cube of three dimensions and a cube of four dimensions, and that only the cube of four dimensions will really actually exist. Examining man from this point of view, we come to some very interesting deductions. If the fourth dimension exists, then one of two things is possible. Either we ourselves possess the fourth dimension, i.e. are beings of four dimensions, or we possess only three dimensions and in that case do not exist at all. If the fourth dimension exists while we possess only three, then it means that we have no real existence, that we exist only in somebody's imagination and that all our thoughts, feelings, and experiences take place in the mind of some other higher being who visualizes us. We are but products of their mind and the whole of our universe is but an artificial world created by that fantasy. If we do not agree with this, then we must recognize ourselves as beings of four dimensions. At the same time we must recognize that our own fourth dimension as well as the fourth dimension of the bodies surrounding us is known and felt by us only very little, and that we only guess at its existence from observations of inexplicable phenomena. Such blindness in relation to the fourth dimension may be caused by the fact that the fourth dimension of our own bodies and other objects of our world is too small and inaccessible to our organs of sense, or to the apparatus that widens the sphere of our observation. Exactly in the same way that the molecules of our bodies and many other things are inaccessible to immediate observation. As regards objects possessing a greater extension in the fourth dimension, we feel them at times in certain circumstances but refuse to recognize them as really existing. These last considerations give us sufficient grounds for believing that at least in our physical world, the fourth dimension must refer to the domain of small magnitude. The fact that we do not see in things their fourth dimension brings us again to the problem of the imperfection of our perceptions in general. Even if we leave aside other defects of our perception and regard its activity only in relation to geometry, we shall have to admit that we see everything as very unlike what it really is. We do not see bodies, we see nothing but surfaces, sides and lines. We never see a cube, we see only a small part of it, never see it from all sides at once. From the fourth dimension it must be possible to see the cube from all the sides at once and from within, as though from its center, from its chakra. The center of a sphere is inaccessible to us. To reach it we must cut or dig our way through the mass of the sphere, i.e. act in exactly the same way as the plane being with regard to the circle. The process of cutting through it will in that case appear to us as a gradual change in the surface of the sphere. The complete analogy of our relation to the sphere with the relation of the plane being to the circle gives us grounds for thinking that in the fourth dimension or along the fourth dimension, the center of a sphere is as easily accessible as is the center of a circle in the third dimension. In other words, we have a right to suppose that in the fourth dimension it is possible to reach the center of a sphere from some region unknown to us, along some incomprehensible direction, the sphere itself remaining intact. The latter circumstance would appear to us as a kind of miracle, but just as miraculous to the plane being must appear the possibility of reaching the center of a circle without disturbing its circumference, without breaking up the circle. Continuing to imagine further the properties of vision of perception in the fourth dimension. We shall have to recognize that not only in a geometrical sense, but also in many other senses, it is possible from the fourth dimension to see in objects of our world much more than we do see. Professor Helmholtz once said about the human eye that if an optician sent him so badly made an instrument, he would never accept it. Undoubtedly our eye does not see a great many things which exist. But, if in the fourth dimension we see without the aid of such an imperfect instrument, we should be bound to see much more. That is, to see what is invisible for us now and to see everything without that net of illusion which veils the whole world from us, and makes its outward aspect very unlike what really is. The question may arise why we should see in the fourth dimension without the aid of eyes and what it means. It will be possible to answer these questions definitely only once it is clearly known that the fourth dimension exists, and when it is known what really is. But so far, it is possible only to consider what might be in the fourth dimension, and therefore there cannot be any final answers to these questions. Vision in the fourth dimension must be effected without the help of the eyes. The limits of eyesight are known, and it is understood that the human eye can never attain the perfection even of a microscope or telescope. But these instruments, with all the increase of the power of vision that they afford, do not bring us in the least nearer to the fourth dimension. So it may be concluded that vision in the fourth dimension must be something quite different from ordinary vision. But what can it actually be? It would probably be something analogous to the vision by which a bird flying over Canada sees South America where it migrates for the winter. Or the vision of a carrier pigeon which sees hundreds of miles away, its loft from which it has been taken in a closed basket. Or the vision of an engineer making the first calculations and the first drafts of a bridge, who sees this bridge and the trains passing over it. Or the vision of a man who, consulting a timetable, envisions himself arriving at the station of departure and his train arriving at its destination.